Hello and welcome to the eighth video in this series. Today I'm going to be talking about migration and exploitation in the United States. Today's video, or assigned video if you want to do that in advance, would be Aviva Chomsky's talk on immigration and incarceration, which I am going to link down below. She does a wonderful job of describing what is the modern narrative or myth about immigration, and then breaking it down and proposing an alternative. So I'm going to go ahead and also recap that talk for you in case you want to skip over it. But obviously you'll get much more depth from her own video. And of course that will be linked down below. But let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. So I prompted my students with this question, and you're welcome to think about it if you'd like, but I asked them about, do you have past experience with immigration, or does your family? And unless you're Native American, the answer is going to be yes. And, you can think about where does that history of immigration in your family come from? And then what brought them or you to the United States, and what are the connections to any of the past subjects we've talked about? And then finally, do you believe in the American dream? Why or why not? And we're going to come back to this topic a little bit later on. So if you want to think about it now, go right ahead and pause the video. But I'm going to move into recapping Aviva Chomsky's talk on is criminalization, immigration, and citizenship in the 21st century. So first, Chomsky begins by describing the traditional narrative of immigration in the United States, one that is generally of the gradual expansion of who is allowed to be an immigrant, who is allowed to be a citizen, from the first English immigrants to those coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, to finally, after a period of quotas in the early 20th century, to opening it up in the 1960s to everyone and anyone who wants to be an immigrant to the United States. But Chomsky dispels this narrative, and she says there's a lot that it leaves out, beginning with the start of immigration as a part of the racial project of elimination and replacement of Native peoples. That would be what we talked about in the second video, settler colonialism. So immigration in the United States originated from this desire to replace the Native Americans. And she also acknowledges that some of the first immigrants were obviously the slaves who were forcibly brought to the United States. But these people are not included in the traditional narrative, nor is the description of settler colonialism. Moving onward, she regards that citizenship was restricted to only those who were white, right up until the end of slavery and the establishment of the 14th Amendment, which allows for naturalization by birth. So citizenship is opened up not just to white Americans, but now to the emancipated slaves or Black Americans. But this presents a problem for the racial mix of the United States. And as a result, they begin to restrict the immigrant populations of that time. So in the 19th century, there was Chinese immigration, and they begin to gradually restrict Chinese immigration. First, Chinese women, so they cannot have children who will then be citizens. Then Mexicans are made illegible for citizenship. And the same goes for Native Americans, who actually don't become American citizens until the 1920s. She notes that at the same time that this is taking place, the Mexican-American War is fought. And while the US adopts a large swath of Mexican land, they do their best to exclude the people, and then they promote white settlement in those areas to obviously establish a white racial mix in those new states. By 1924, she says there's three sets of laws. Whites are promoted for immigration, Asians are excluded from immigration, and Mexicans function as laborers, not migrants. So, to give a little bit of clarity to this last statement, for example, the Bracero Guest Worker Program was a program that brought thousands and thousands of Mexicans to the United States as laborers, particularly in agriculture, without opening up a pathway for citizenship, essentially making them a deportable labor source. And in fact, they were deported after World War II when um, when people returned from the front of the war. Then they were no longer needed. Um, but actually, by 1965, there's a key change in immigration. And at this point, the civil rights movement is making it, I wrote here, indefensible to discriminate on racial grounds. So they abolish racial quotas and they begin to prioritize family relations and skills. Um, but there begins to be a new form of discrimination. And this is one rationalized on the basis of legality. So which crossing the border suddenly becomes illegal. Up to this point, um, Mexicans were crossing the border in hundreds of thousands a year to work. It was not illegal, and it was an integral part of the American economy. Suddenly, with this new law, all these people find themselves criminalized. And this leads to the rise of illegal immigration that we are dealing with as a quote unquote crisis today. That's going to be a large part of the focus of this lecture. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on that in a second. But I want to add something to Chomsky's talk that she does not mention, which is that the law in 1965, at its core, is not really this like benevolent, forward-looking law where they're suddenly opening up immigration to everyone regardless of race. I mean, at least that's the way the rhetoric is. But, I put a quote here from the American Legion of Representatives, which was advocating for this law. And they said, the national origin system, which is the system they had in place to predominantly bring people from white European countries. So the national origin system wasn't struck down. Nobody is quite so apt to be of the same national origins of our present citizens as are members of their immediate families. And the great bulk of immigrants henceforth will not merely hail from the same parent countries as our present citizens, but will be their close relatives. So the motivation here was still to keep the country white. Obviously, the law did not work out this way, but it was still explicitly a part of the motivation behind this change. Okay, so I want to go into a little bit more detail on the concept of inventing illegality, starting in this period of the 1960s. Chomsky says that the laws themselves were written with the express purpose of creating this new status of illegality, because it served the purpose of keeping workers exploitable. So as I mentioned, in the same period, there was hundreds of thousands of people crossing the borders every year for work, moving back and forth impermanently. At this point, border crossing suddenly becomes dangerous and it becomes illegal. So a lot of people end up staying permanently. These people become a new permanent legal caste that's excluded from rights to public services and housing, formal work, voting, serving on juries. This is what's called the new Jim Crow. It's the new establishment of a legal class based on illegality that allows particular people to be exploited or excluded from parts of society. This includes Black Americans, which we're going to talk about in the next video, uh, primarily due to the war on drugs, and it also includes illegal immigrants, as I mentioned. Also, over time, the policies are expanded for deportable offenses, and the authority of judges to alleviate harsh consequences of deportation are limited. So, this system, this really harsh system of punishment, becomes more and more ingrained. It also becomes more and more ingrained in people's thinking. There's a climate of fear created around illegal immigration that justifies the oppression of undocumented immigrants. And it also allows these, islands of prosperities to preserve and justify their own privilege. So their own access to certain types of work or certain public programs or citizenship, right? And all the things that come with it. While at the same time blaming immigrants for, I'm sure you heard the rhetoric before and I don't have to reiterate it, rather than blaming the law and the way the law was created, or even punishing employers instead. So I want to talk a little bit about the rhetoric I just mentioned. Um, when this law is established and this change happens in the 60s, this is the way it's talked about. It says, "Today, with my signature, this system is abolished. We can now believe that it will never again shadow the gate to the American nation with the twin barriers of prejudice and privilege. Our beautiful America was built by a nation of strangers. From 100 different places or more, they have poured forth into an empty land, joining and blending in one mighty and irresistible tide." So if you have watched my videos, you'll probably have an immediate reaction to this. One about the empty land, another about a nation of strangers. Um, Obviously, there's a lot of things in this kind of rhetoric that might have a great positive feel to them, but they're part of the myth that allows many of these injustices that we've talked about to happen and to be accepted into our society. As a result, you start getting rhetoric like these on the right hand side at the same time as kind of the mirror reflection. Obama says, "We simply cannot allow people to pour into the United States undetected, undocumented, unchecked, and circumventing the line of people who are waiting patiently, diligently, and lawfully to become immigrants in this country." Uh, Obama, of course, has been termed by some people the deporter in chief for the amount of people that he deported. So it's important to acknowledge this occurs across party lines. Meanwhile, not meanwhile, but after the fact, you even get someone like President Trump who says, "When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people who have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime. They're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people." So, sorry, I know it's terrible, but I find it a bit comical. Obviously, there's an elevation of this rhetoric, and it's really hateful rhetoric too. That goes from talking about, people who are cutting in front of the line, to people who are criminals and dangerous. And this is the kind of rhetoric that allows such a system to continue, despite the fact that before the 1960s, illegality didn't exist, border crossing was allowed. Um, so there's this fundamental change that takes place, and it's kind of been internalized into our system. All right. What I think is also important to talk about here is how the rise in illegal immigration is also historically linked to America's own actions. And we are reaping the consequences of what we have done in other countries. So you can see here that the percent of immigrants is increasingly coming from the Americas. So why is this? And how is it linked to the United States itself? So we talked about interventionism and we talked about neocolonial institutions, and these play a large role. US intervention throughout Mexican and Central American history has been absolutely persistent and has continued to the modern day. There have been successive assassinations um, for Mexican revolutionary leaders in the early 20th century, but especially numerous interventions in Central America and elsewhere, even under President Obama, even into the modern day. And, the same goes for neocolonial institutions, which established neoliberal policies that destroyed numerous, Central American industries and agriculture. There's been NAFTA, the trade agreement, which opened Mexican borders, eliminated many rural jobs and family farms in Mexico while benefiting US corporations. And then there's been the US support for the war on drugs, which has fueled further violence in Mexico, among many others. So these are all the factors that have played a part in pushing people into the United States. Meanwhile, our rhetoric is increasingly saying we can't allow these people in, it's unjust, but we're creating the conditions for it at the same time. All right. If you're interested in learning more, I highly recommend you watch this video from Al Jazeera on how US involvement in Central America led to the border crisis. It's quite too long for me to play it here, but I think it does a wonderful job of highlighting some of these examples. Okay, I want to make one amendment to the general narrative. Um, while illegal immigration continues, there's also been a return of, what some people say is the Bracero program all over again. So the Trump era has witnessed an increase in the issuance of particularly H-2A visas. These guest worker programs are particularly for Mexicans who make up 90% of the visas, but also other Central Americans. And they serve to bring these guest workers in on a temporary basis while keeping them really vulnerable and exploitable to keep, their wages low and, if necessary, there's just a turnaround of the people who are involved in the program. So for example, if you suffer an injury on the job, if you're disobedient or you speak out about the conditions, you simply won't be brought back the next season. The program also deliberately chooses immigrants from the furthest parts of Mexico so they don't have support networks in the United States. There's been a lot of research on this topic, UCLA professors especially who've looked into this, showing that this is almost a return of the Bracero program. Since COVID-19, there's also been a high exposure to disease, an attempt to legislate even lower wages for these workers. But I just want to mention that there's been a slight change, not slight, it's actually a quite dramatic change that's been occurring. But I want to make this amendment to the narrative that there has been a return of these guest worker programs. All right. So I want to talk about the economic effects more broadly by looking at labor and drawing a distinction between the different immigrant groups who came to the United States. So new European immigrants who came to the United States were also exploited and also discriminated against. But what I do want to point out is that they had some semblance of mobility and then integration into the United States. So they owned farms, they were able to own businesses, they were able to work in factories as well. Meanwhile, Chinese immigrants who also functioned as cheap labor were restricted from buying land and they were restricted legally from a lot of jobs. So they were mostly limited to working on railroads, laundry, and cooking. At the same time, Mexicans who were dispossessed of their land, especially after the Mexican-American War, they were limited to working simply as manual laborers, cattle herders, or cartmen. And they were also included into the system of mass incarceration or system of imprisonment, based on laws like vagrancy that applied to even, slaves after they were emancipated. So there is some distinction in the mobility between these different groups and their labor opportunities, which obviously has an effect. By the 1920s, which I discussed, uh, Chinese immigrants were ousted, and Mexicans could stay only as laborers. And in the Bracero guest worker program, there was very little pay and often unpaid wages. There's still some Bracero workers who are alive today and very old who haven't been paid their wages from that period. Um, the Officer of the U.S. Department of Labor and the head of the Bracero program, you know, described it himself as nothing short of legalized slavery. So I'm trying to give a brief overview of the economic mobility of different immigrant groups over time. Okay, looking post 1964. Illegal immigrants continue to provide a steady, exploitable labor force at substandard wages. Some studies suggest that they're about 5% of the modern labor force. Additionally, while there's this continued rhetoric saying we should stop illegal immigration or we should deport illegal immigrants, studies have shown that entire industries would be eliminated or the economy would be dramatically changed if we did not have illegal labor. So the total elimination of immigrant labor would have uh, drastic effects. For example, in the dairy industry, in which a study's been done, where it says that the loss of immigrant labor would increase milk prices by 90%. And that's just one example. Um, there's another that says if federal labor and immigration policies reduce the number of foreign-born workers by 50%, more than 3,500 dairy farms would close. So the effects are significant, and illegal immigrants form a really key part of our economy. As for H-2A and H-2B visa workers, they also form a deportable labor source at low wages. So when they're needed, they can be brought in temporarily, and when they're not needed, these programs can be brought to an end. All right. I don't want to go into too much detail on this slide, but I want to bring up the fact that if uh, if you are interested in learning more about the effects of immigrants on the economy, I highly recommend Aviva Chomsky's book, They Take Our Jobs and 20 Other Myths About Immigration. She also has a talk on the topic. But she talks about questions like illegal immigrants hurt the economy, illegal immigrants take our jobs, illegal immigrants don't pay taxes. And she points out that she makes many good points, which I put a few here to briefly touch on. Um, For example, you have to ask, like, who does this benefit? If you are a business owner, it's going to benefit you to have really cheap labor. Um, Illegal immigrants also create consumer demand, and they create even more jobs. At the same time, you know, the legal system allows for dangerous conditions and low wages. So, the jobs that illegal immigrants take are really undesirable to domestic workers. I think this is commonly acknowledged at this point. And, furthermore, illegal immigrants do pay taxes, 7 billion each year. And at the same time, they often don't take advantage of the public programs that are available to them. So um, they are, contributors to the American economy. And there's a quote here that mass deportation would immediately reduce the nation's GDP by 1.4% and ultimately by 2.6%. But of course, we have to ask ourselves, is that even, a question we should be asking? You might recall in the lecture on um, interventionism, the same question was posed by Noam Chomsky, who said that, we can talk about the economic effects of interventionism, but it's also a moral question. So if you're interested in learning more, you could go ahead and read Aviva Chomsky's book or her lecture online, which is on YouTube. Okay, I'm going to skip over that. So hopefully I've given an overview of the history of immigration and its economic effects, especially with illegal immigration in the modern day. And I want to pose several questions in this regard, which is that The laws that enforce illegality have virtually no effect on the flow of immigrants. So, why are these laws staying in place? And I think, we've addressed that within this talk, but might have additional points to make. And what is the purpose of anti immigrant rhetoric in creating a climate of fear? So, and finally, if we created illegality, is it possible to uncreate it? And how can we do so? And then one final question: does the American dream exist? And for whom does it exist? And that's the initial question I posed in the introduction. So I'm going to stop right there. Um, it's quite a difficult topic to present because there's so much history of immigration and the economic effects have been different for each group. But hopefully, this has given you an idea of the history and allowed you to start thinking about these concepts, and especially about illegal immigration, which affects us so much in the modern day. The next video that I will be filming will be on mass incarceration. So it's deeply linked to illegal immigration, um, but also very relevant to what we were talking about in terms of policies towards Black Americans. And the there's two possible assigned videos, or assigned videos if you would like to watch them. One is the documentary 13th, which is free on YouTube, and the other is a talk by Michelle Alexander on the new Jim Crow, her book on mass incarceration. And I will also mention it briefly in the next video, but if you'd like, you can go ahead and look into those. And I very much look forward to filming that next video and putting it online for you all. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you in that next video. Bye.